Lisa Combs, and this week on Behavior Bites, we're going to be talking about a concept that most people feel like they have a fairly good handle on, but sometimes they're missing some of the nuances of understanding it that really keep them from being able to apply it effectively. So the concept we're talking about this week is, what is reinforcement versus punishment? So that seems like an easy question, right? We would all recognize something that's a reward versus something that's a punishment. So losing recess, a punishment for sure, right? Getting to attend a class party, reward for sure, right? Those would be two examples of something that people would typically define in very predictable ways. And yet we really can't know whether either of those things is a reward or punishment until we see the outcome of the effect on the student's behavior. So this is a really, really critical thing for us to understand if we're going to be effective at implementing behavioral interventions. So let me explain. In behavioral terms, a reinforcer means something that, when it's presented after a behavior, increases the chances that that behavior is going to keep occurring, okay? And a punishment is something that occurs after a behavior that decreases the chances that that behavior is going to happen again. So let's think for a moment back to the examples that I gave and say, let's see that withholding recess is a punishment. That's something that we almost always think of as a punishment, and many schools use that as a consequence in the behavior management system, is that for certain infractions, you lose a recess or lose part of a recess. So for most students, for many students at least, that would be a punishment in that, let's say that I lose recess for calling someone else a name, okay? And so I have to stay in at recess. And for most students, that would be a punishment. But maybe for me, I have some social issues and I kind of dread recess because I don't have any friends to play with. And sometimes I am the target of bullying on the playground, okay? And so when I get recess withheld and I have to sit in the room with the paraprofessional by myself, that's actually a break for me from some of the social expectations that occur during recess. And it's a break from having to worry about being bullied, and it's just kind of a break for me in my day. So I decide, well, what else can I do to get removed from recess? Well, I could call somebody a name again because I know that is what got me removed from recess today. And so in that case, the loss of a recess, which was intended as a punishment, actually increased the likelihood that I'm going to call someone a name again. So in essence, removal from recess in that situation is a reinforcer because it's increasing the likelihood that the student is going to engage in that misbehavior again. Let's think of the other example where we said the class party surely is a reward, right? But for that same student who has social anxiety and who likes predictability and who doesn't like to be in unstructured situations, maybe that classroom party is not really enticing to them. It's not going to be rewarding. And so when we say, if you get all of your homework turned in, all grading period, then you will be able to partake in the class party at the end of the grading period. That may not be enough of an incentive to increase the likelihood that that student is going to do their homework because it's just not incentive for that child. It's not valuable. So we always have to make sure that when we are deciding what we're going to use either as an incentive or a reinforcer or a negative consequence, a punishment, that we're really giving some thought to whether that's going to have the intended effect on that particular student. We need to make sure that the payday that we're giving that student is really motivating to them and incentive enough for them to change their behavior. We've talked in some of our other episodes or issues of Behavior Bites about how a student has to be kind of have a reason to want to change behavior. Behavior is hard to change, especially behavior that we've practiced and engaged in for a long time and are pretty comfortable with. So the incentive to do so has to be meaningful to us. Most of us would not show up for work, for instance, if we were going to get gummy worms as a payday, because it might be a positive. We might like gummy worms, but it's probably not a high enough incentive to ask us to get up every morning and leave home and go to work for 6 hours a day. The pay has to match the demand of the task. And so it's really important that you make sure that if you're offering a reinforcer, it's a reinforcer that that child wants. Otherwise, it's unlikely to increase the positive behavior that you want. By the same token, you really have to make sure when you are deciding consequences that that consequence is going to have the intended effect. Because sometimes, for instance, a classic example where someone might be accidentally reinforcing a behavior that they're trying to reduce would be, for instance, a child who enjoys the attention from a power struggle. And so when they refuse to do something and the teacher calls them out in front of the whole class, and the whole class is now attending to them, and the teacher begins to argue with that student, and the student argues back, and everybody's watching, the teacher calling that student out in front of everyone was intended as a negative response that would decrease that behavior, because most of us are mortified when we're called out in front of our peers. So that was intended by the teacher as a punishment that would decrease the likelihood of that student not complying with what I asked. But in reality, some students enjoy the attention that they get from being called out in a negative way by the teacher and then engaging in a power struggle that everyone's watching. And so me as the teacher engaging with that student, calling them out in front of everyone and then arguing with them might actually increase the chances that they do it again tomorrow because they liked the outcome. And so in that sense, calling that student out in front of their peers really was a reinforcement. We don't really know whether something is a reinforcer or a punishment until we see the outcome on their behavior. But we can probably, when we know our students well and we can kind of look at the history of their behavior and what happened before and what happened afterwards, we can sometimes see patterns and go, oh yeah, this kid is reinforced by the teacher arguing with them or the teacher calling them out in front of others. So we probably don't want to do that anymore because we're actually increasing the chances of them doing it even more in order to get that response. Or, well, we offered the class party as an incentive, but it has had no impact on making him turn his work in, so we're probably going to have to come up with a different incentive that is more motivating to that student. It's really, really important to understand that you don't know whether something is reinforcing or punishing just by virtue of how you would feel about it. You have to look at the result on the student's behavior, the outcome on the student's behavior after applying that intervention. So give that some thought, and I would like you to think about a student maybe that you have had in the past whose behavior you really had a hard time cracking, and think about the consequence that was applied, whether it was positive or negative, whether you anticipated it as a reinforcer or a punishment, and ask yourself, did that thing that I was presenting as the consequence, did it result in the behavior increasing or decreasing? And that's the only way you'll know whether it was a reinforcer or a punisher and whether it had the effect that you intended. So I hope you have some good conversation about that. And if you're stuck with a student that you're not making headway with, always come back to looking at that contingency that you set up and seeing if the consequence that you delivered had the intended effect, positive or negative. Thanks and have a great day.